Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed faculty, distinguished students and honored guests, it is with great pleasure that I stand before you today to welcome you to the inaugural class of our postgraduate certificate program in English Studies. This day is not only a testament to the academic excellence of our institution, but also to the determination and teamwork of everyone involved in bringing this program to life. This journey began when our Vice Rector of Research, Postgraduate Education and Innovation issued a call for proposals for new postgraduate courses. In that moment, a vision emerged, a vision of a program that would bring advanced English studies to students across the country, regardless of where they live. It was a vision to bridge distances, expand opportunities, and enable a diverse group of scholars to pursue a deeper understanding of English language, literature, and culture. The journey wasn't without its challenges. Creating a comprehensive, high-quality program that aligns with the demands of postgraduate education requires a significant investment of time, resources, and creative problem-solving. But it was this shared vision and commitment to innovation that allowed us to overcome each hurdle. Every meeting, every draft, every revision has brought us to this day, a day to celebrate the fruits of our collective efforts. We're immensely proud of what has been achieved, and we're even more excited to what lies ahead. Today, you embark on a journey of intellectual discovery and critical engagements. This program will challenge you, expand your perspectives, and deepen your understanding of English studies in a way that is both academically enriching and personally transformative. We're honored to have you join us to be a part of your academic and professional growth. Together, we will build a vibrant learning community connected not by physical proximity, but by a shared passion for knowledge, inquiry, and scholarship. Thank you all for being here today, and welcome to this new chapter in your academic journey. Let us make this program a source of pride for everyone involved and a stepping stone for each of you towards achieving your aspirations. Welcome to the Postgraduate Certificate Program in English Studies. Thank you. Now, to open our celebration and our inaugural class, I'd like to invite Dr. José Luís de Oliveira Silva, our Vice Rector of Research, Postgraduate Education and Innovation. He's a full professor, and he holds a degree in history from the State University of Piauí, a postgraduate certificate and a master's degree in Brazilian history from the Federal University of Piauí, and a PhD also in history from the Federal University of Goiás. He's going to deliver this address in Portuguese. Let's hear. Professor José Luís.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Primeiro, agradecer pelo convite e agradecer, minha fala será bem breve, agradecer particularmente a ideia de comprar esse projeto dessa pós em inglês, né, na pessoa do professor Israel Noleto, que é um pouco mais de um ano, né, Israel, que você nos procura para essa possibilidade. Finalmente, hoje nós temos a aula inaugural dessa pós. Assim como agradecer toda a equipe do campus, professores, professoras, servidores do campus que de alguma forma colaboram com essa pós, e professores e professoras também de outros campos do IFP que eventualmente vão estar ministrando aula. E finalmente agradecer a direção geral do campus, Campo Maior, na pessoa do professor Danilo Alves, que está aqui presente também nessa abertura, que prontamente atendeu o pedido e aceitou a execução desse projeto no campus. Tenho certeza que é um projeto que já nasce vitorioso, porque conheço parte das pessoas que estão encabeçando o projeto, sei da sua competência, do empenho dessas pessoas e da necessidade de uma pós como essa, gratuita, né, para servidores, professoras, professores e alunos, enfim, de outras instituições que eventualmente não conseguiriam fazer uma pós que não fosse essa, nesse estilo, que está sendo ofertado pelo Instituto Federal do Piauí. Então, deixo aqui meus agradecimentos, particularmente pela ideia e ter comprado o desafio de levar essa pós, né, aqui no Instituto Federal do Piauí. Era isso, obrigado, Israel.
Obrigado, professor. Thank you, professor, very much for your words. And now, following our program, we're going to hear our campus director, Professor Danilo Alves Nascimento. Also, Danilo. Oh, this address will also be delivered in Portuguese. Sorry. Yeah.
Boa tarde a todos e todas. Quero inicialmente aqui saudar o professor Dr. José Luiz, pró-reitor de pesquisa dessa instituição, aqui representando o nosso magnífico reitor, professor Dr. Paulo Bote da Cunha. Saudar o diretor de Educação à Distância, professor Raimundo Menezes. Saudar o diretor da Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa, professor Emanuel Luiz, também que se encontra aqui. E, inicialmente, eu quero desejar a todos e todas boas-vindas, né, a esta pós-graduação em Letras em Inglês, pós-graduação em Lato Sensu. É um prazer tê-los como estudantes aqui neste curso, que é um curso do Campo Maior, e que todos encontrem aqui todas as condições melhores possíveis para a realização de um curso desta envergadura, que é uma especialização em Letras em Inglês. Eu quero também, assim como o professor José Luiz, agradecer a todos os professores, a todos os docentes do corpo, né, que fazem parte desta equipe, e tanto os professores do Campo Maior como de outros campos. Mais um agradecimento especial ao professor Dr. Israel Noleto, a qual eu tenho muito apreço e admiração, né? E é um professor que, assim que retornou do doutorado, com toda força, né, já trouxe várias ideias, vários programas, enfim, está fazendo muito bem sua parte. Professor Israel, hoje a gente concretiza um projeto, né, que nasceu de uma ideia sua, e a gente fica muito feliz em poder estar aqui compartilhando isso com você também, né? Agradecer aos palestrantes da tarde de hoje, que ainda teremos. No mais, pessoal, é isso. Desejar boas-vindas, né? Que todos tenham aí um excelente evento, uma excelente aula inaugural. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Professor Danilo. Now we have two keynote speakers that will address different topics concerning many areas of teaching of English. But, believe it or not, we are a bit ahead of schedule. So we are still 5 minutes to go until the first keynote speaker, and he hasn't yet joined us. But let's just wait a few more minutes to see if he is able to join us. We are exactly 5 minutes ahead. So while we wait, let me translate some of the things that Professor Danilo and Professor José Luiz said in their addresses. We have here already one of our keynote speakers who doesn't understand Portuguese, and I believe didn't quite understand much of what was said. But this is especially for you, Jessica. And this project began about 1 year ago, more than 1 year ago. And our Vice Rector of Research, Postgraduate Education and Innovation, Professor José Luiz, issued a call for proposals for postgraduate courses. So immediately that caught my attention, and I decided to sit down and write a proposal. I invited the professors that are part of our team, of our faculty now, and they promptly accepted the invitation. And after that, we started working on the proposal. It took a lot of work, a lot of effort, And we also had to overcome some bureaucratic issues along the way. But now we are very happy to see the results. Oh, and in addition to that, when we issued the call for applications, we were surprised at how many people applied from all over Brazil. We have 21 slots, 21 openings for students, but some 543 people applied from all over Brazil. So it was like a 26 to 1 competition. So it was a lot of competition. We were very happy with the repercussion of this course. Yeah, thank you, Jess. So as I told the students in the orientation tab on our platform, this is a Moodle course. So on our platform, I wrote, you are allowed, you were entitled to pat yourselves on the back because you went through a lot of competition and emerged victorious at the end. So still, while we wait, why not talk about our program for today? So we have 2 keynote speakers prepared. The first one will be joining us in a few minutes. The second is going to be Jessica Knowledge. She was one of my supervisors in my PhD, so I know a little about her work, not as much as I would like to. I've read her book twice now, and I'll probably read it a 3rd time. So I encourage you to have a look of her book as well. After the keynote speakers, we're going to have a short section explaining what the course holds for you and what courses we have to offer and what these courses are about. We'll also have a short section to introduce all the professors, and after which we're going to have some time to talk to you students. We want to get to know you and want you to get to know us. Jess, our first keynote speaker hasn't arrived. So do you think we could start with you?
Sure.
Okay, so let me just introduce you properly.
I have slides as well. Am I okay to share when you've done?
Yeah. Right, folks. Slight change of plans. Since Steve Kaufman hasn't arrived, we'll start with Jessica Knowledge. Jessica Knowledge is Assistant Professor in Stylistics at the University of Nottingham in the UK, where she teaches across literary linguistics and applied linguistics. She is a stylistician and discourse analyst with particular expertise in cognitive poetics of emotion, feminist stylistics, and world theories in dystopian fiction. She is the author of The Language of Dystopia, published by Palgrave Macmillan, 2022, and co-editor of Reading Fictional Languages from Edinburgh University Press, 2023. She's going to be talking about conceptual metaphors theory. So let's hear her.
Thanks so much, Israel. Okay, let's see how this looks. Are they showing for you? Sorry, it's just not showing the right version of the slides. Let me try again. There we go. Is that full screen now?
No, not yet.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to both your celebration and to your inaugural event. It's honestly an honor to be here with you all, and I hope you have the most amazing semester. Israel asked me to talk to you about combining literary and linguistic studies, which is perfect because as a literary linguist, I'm a stylistician, I sit right at the interface between language and literature. And I'm hoping today, in a very brief space of time, to signal to you some of the importance of both of those areas coming together under one umbrella. So, what is stylistics then? As I imagine it's quite new to some of you as a discipline. So to offer you a definition from the wonderful Jeff Leach and Mick Short, seminal authors in the discipline, stylistics, simply defined as the linguistic study of style, is rarely undertaken for its own sake, simply as an exercise in describing what use is made of. Oh, I can see them.
Me too.
People in your chat say they're okay. Should I keep going? Okay. Simply as an exercise in describing what use is made of language. So we normally study style because we want to explain something. And in general, literary stylistics has implicitly or explicitly the goal of explaining the relation between language and artistic function. So according to Leach and Short, its motivating questions are not so much what as why and how. Now, traditional literary criticism is really good at the what. And so it's a really good starting point for any literary linguistic investigation. So you might use traditional literary criticism, for example, as your starting point. Perhaps you're interested in a particular text or a particular author or a particular genre, and you've gone away, found some good literary critical analysis and think, actually, there's something there. What can I use language to investigate? You might also use it to frame a linguistic analysis, so to situate a linguistic piece of work against material that already exists in a literary sphere. It can be really useful as supporting argument. So if you put forward a literary linguistic analysis, you need both the linguistics and the literary criticism to come together hand in hand. Or alternatively, you might use traditional literary discourse as a part of counterpoint, so something to argue against. And all of these are brilliant ways of getting at the what a particular text is about. What literary criticism is less good at is the why a text means a certain thing, and how it's showing you that particular interpretation. And for that, you need stylistics. So to show you how this might work, bringing together the literary and the linguistic, I'm going to do a very brief, speedy stylistic analysis of an extract from The Handmaid's Tale. As Israel mentioned, I specialise in dystopian fiction and in feminist stylistics, so this is a good text for me to work on. But I'm also hoping that given both the popularity of Margaret Atwood and the recent success of the TV adaptation, that all of you will at least be familiar with the narrative if you haven't actually read it. So The Handmaid's Tale is a text about a speculative future in which fertile women, the handmaids, are sort of commissioned to reproduce for this society in this particularly sort of oppressed role. So there's a lot there about gender and power and about the representation of the handmaid character. If we look to literary criticism first, we see these kind of interpretations then around the role of the handmaid and about the representation of gender and the role of these women in the text. So this is taken from a chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Margaret Atwood, in where Appleton says, in her later novel, The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood keenly demonstrates how the women are forcibly separated from their bodies in the first place, and why the dominant society goes to such extremes to enforce those separations. In the first chapter of The Handmaid's Tale, Offred claims that even though they have been deprived of civil rights, the handmaids still had their bodies. She is mistaken. Offred, like the other handmaids, is paradoxically both defined by and deprived of her body. She is categorically denied the privilege of using her body however she chooses, yet she is also condemned to continued symbolic exposure. So there's something for this particular critic about the role of the body in this particular text and the way that Offred has or hasn't got control over her physical self. So there's point one. If we look to another critic, we see something similar. So Stillman and Johnson also reflect on Offred's body and her reproductive potential. So they argue that defined in terms of her reproductive potential, Offred, so the main handmaid character, has little to be other than a set of ovaries, a receptacle. Prevented from intersubjective interactions and communications of any but an extremely limited and repressed sort, without privacy and scope for her own will, and lacking any socially sanctioned purpose or self beyond her reproductive organs, each handmaid, like Offred, must struggle to maintain any sense of her identity as she faces empty days and lonely nights. So an argument being put forward here and in the previous example that these women are nothing more than receptacles for a child, so nothing more than their reproductive organs. Now these are really good, solid starting points for a piece of criticism, but there's nothing here on the text itself. So they don't give any examples from The Handmaid's Tale. They're not showing how this particular interpretation has been reached. And we can get that to enhance this argument through a stylistic analysis. And to show you this, I'm going to choose an extract from The Handmaid's Tale first to show you a point that I think looks at this concept. And then very briefly, I'm going to show you how a conceptual metaphor theory analysis can reveal the argument that those critics have just made. So here's the extract. This is taken from the appendices, so at the end of the novel, where they reflect on the Gileadian regime. It was clear from internal evidence that she, Offred, was among the first wave of women recruited for reproductive purposes and allotted to those who both required such services and could lay claim to them through their position in the elite. Men highly placed in the regime were thus able to pick and choose among women who had demonstrated their reproductive fitness by having produced one or more healthy children, a desirable characteristic in an age of plummeting Caucasian birth rates, a phenomenon observable not only in Gilead, but in most northern Caucasian societies at the time. So a very brief extract, but this, if you've noticed, is absolutely dripping in metaphor. So let's see if we can pull some of those apart. To do this, the tool or the framework I'm going to briefly introduce you to, conceptual metaphor theory, is one which defined the cognitive turn in the arts and humanities. So the moment when research in cognitive linguistics, cognitive science, found its way into sort of linguistic and literary study. And it was developed by Lakoff and Johnson in their wonderful book, Metaphors We Live By, which I would highly recommend. Lakoff and Johnson's argument was that we can understand all metaphor in discourse as being part of two domains, or as the relationship between two domains. So we have a source domain, the thing that you're familiar with, and we have a target domain, which is the thing you're trying to describe. And in understanding any metaphor, you map characteristics from the source domain onto the target domain. So if I was to give you a famous literary example, like Juliet is the sun from Romeo and Juliet, You have Juliet, your target, the character who you've only just met, who we're trying to describe, and we have the sun, your source, something you know about. And you map characteristic from the sun, it's light, it's beautiful, it's life-giving, onto Juliet. Note what you're not doing is mapping over things like it's a star on fire millions of miles away, because that's not relevant to Julietness. So you're mapping over characteristics from the source to the target. So if we keep that one basic notion, so the foundation of this model, how can this help us understand the metaphors in that extract? So if I go back to it, the first one that stands out to me is the use of the phrase first wave and recruited. So normally if I was in a seminar, I'd ask you this, but if you think in your head, who do we normally recruit? Not women, usually for reproductive purposes, we recruit soldiers. And similarly, the notion of a first wave would be something that you would have in sort of army military movements. If you think about when you apply to the military, you have to undergo a fitness test. And similarly, these recruits have to go through a reproductive fitness test to join this first wave. So we have here the conceptual metaphor, a woman is a soldier. And so we're understanding this in terms of recruitment. The important part with the interpretation of The Handmaid's Tale, of course, is that they are not recruited because this is not voluntary. What else is in here? So we have the notion of these women being allotted. We don't technically or typically allot people. We allot services or goods, and we see that in the required such services statement. So we have here the notion of a woman as a commodity, so something which can be given away or distributed. Already, this is not painting a great picture, is it? What else is in this one example? The men in the highly placed in the regime are able to pick and choose among women. There's a sense here of women as objects. We pick and select things, objects in the world which we can choose and obtain. So here we have the conceptual metaphor, a woman is an object. We also have this awful phrase here, could lay claim to them. What do we lay claim to? Usually a spoil, so like think the spoils of war, or a prize. So something which you are given because of your success, or in this case, your power. And we see these kinds of metaphors throughout The Handmaid's Tale in the way the women are described. So we have things like, we sat on our benches facing one another as we are transported. We don't transport people, we transport goods. Women are objects. Where without emotion now, almost without feeling, we might be bundles of red cloth. Similarly, women are objects, things that can be given away. I waited, washed, brushed, fed like a prized pig. A woman is an animal. Again, we transport livestock, yeah? Similar thing. We are containers. It is only the inside of our bodies that are important. Think back now to those opening quotations in the literary criticism, that a woman is a receptacle for a child. Here it is in the metaphor, a woman is a container. A thing is valued, this is Aunt Lydia, she says only if it is rare and hard to get. A woman is a valuable object. We want to be valued, girls. She is rich in pauses, which she savors in her mouth. Think of yourselves as pearls. Women are valuable objects, things that can be given away. Women are prizes. There are only women who are fruitful and women who are barren. That is the law. So in this instance, we're thinking of cultivated land, something that's fertile. Again, not something we would usually ascribe to a human. We are two-legged wombs. Women are containers. That's all. Sacred vessels. Women are containers. Ambulatory chalices. Women are containers. These are not human women. These are objects, things that can be given away, things that can be filled. If we bring these together and you look at the representation of the handmaids, of women in this text, this is what you have in the conceptual metaphors. They are inanimate or inhuman, represented by the conceptual metaphors. A woman is an animal, a woman is cultivated land, a woman is an object, a woman is a commodity. They're defined only in relation to a function, the thing that they can give to the higher up elites in their society. They are a container, and they're defined purely in terms of possession. A woman is a prize, a woman is a valuable possession, a valuable object. If we then bring these all together, what you have in the literature and the literary criticism is this argument around the representation of gender and the role of women in The Handmaid's Tale, about them being no more than their bodies. We saw that in both of those opening quotations. And that is mapped very clearly in the language of this text, in the metaphors used to describe the women, the handmaids. So by conducting a systematic cognitive stylistic analysis using something like CMT, we can support and enhance that literary critical argument in a way that fully elucidates the meaning and the representation of gender in that novel. And for me, and for other stylisticians like me, it's that combination, that meeting of the interface between literature and linguistics that is the gold standard of literary analysis. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, Israel. Thank you. These little hands are lovely.
Yeah, I raised my hand by mistake. But thank you very much, Jessica, for this doctor knowledge for this presentation. Now, some people are raising their hands, or maybe they also raised their hands by mistake like I did. So the section is open for questions, so feel free to ask yours. Well, why don't I start? Well, I prepared a question ahead of this presentation, Dr. Knowledge, and while you presented your talk, it came to me something else about CMT.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Antonio says he's formulating his question. No problem, no rush. Antonio, feel free to ask your question when you're ready to. So I was thinking that this topic of metaphor is a very interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of the book Metaphors We Live By. Sometimes people don't think of metaphors as very casual and quotidian things. They think of metaphors as more elaborate language. But we use metaphors all the time in our language. When we talk about, for example, that's not my cup of tea in English. You're comparing something that is within your area of interest to something that usually people like, maybe more in the past, not so much nowadays. Because most people in Britain that I met were actually coffee people rather than tea people. But in Portuguese, I told you once, we have an equivalent expression that also reveals a lot about our culture. So while that's not my cup of tea, it reveals a lot about the culture of the British people. Our expression in Portuguese, that's not my beach, also reveals a lot about our culture. So using metaphors to create a universe, a fictional universe, is a quite useful way of doing it. And I say that Margaret Atwood was very resourceful and very talented in doing so. So do you think that applying CMT to the Handmaid's Tale could result in new interpretations, or especially in the light of the sequel, The Testaments and contemporary feminist discourse? Do you think this is a way to get to new interpretations of the text, or maybe just justifying already established interpretations?
I think it's certainly a way to enliven discussions of the text. I mean, I think anybody that you ask about The Handmaid's Tale is going to tell you that it's about gender, and that they want to talk about it in relation to the sort of the oppression of the female characters, or the power structures evident in that novel. And most of my students who analyze it tend to want to talk about gender. So it's not that it's not been looked at, or that these points haven't been made before. I think what CMT and stylistics can do is evidence those arguments more fully, and go beyond a sort of a very baseline discussion of, oh, gender is really important in this text for these reasons, or here's this feminist critical discussion of the role of women in this text, by showing exactly how Atwood makes that relationship so clear and so poignant in the language of the text. And yeah, the metaphor in it, when you start looking for them, is genius, in the way that with things that are so simple, you know, that you allot a handmaid, or that, you know, they are transported, rather the linguistic choices really clearly highlight how little they mean, or that the value that is ascribed to them, you know, their pearls, their sacred chalices, is only because they are fertile, not because of who they are on any sort of individual level. And I think CMT, more than just literature on its own, can really highlight and emphasize that discussion in such a positive way.
Yeah, very, very, very good. Do you think other sorts of figurative language, like irony, which is something we see a lot also in The Handmaid's Tale, would complicate the application of CMT, or rather facilitate it? What do you think?
I mean, you certainly have to look at how those metaphors are being used, don't you? And who by. So in the quotation that was taken from Aunt Lydia, where she's talking about value, your value, girls, she doesn't mean that. And you understand the underpinning sort of value system of the society that suggests what value actually means. And so, yeah, I think the interpretation around things like irony, authenticity, ethics, all of that can play a part in that interpretive process of understanding how those metaphors work in the discourse society of the world that you're looking at.
Yeah, right. Hannah has a question. She wrote it in the chat. If you want to, Hannah, you may open your mic and read your question yourself.
If not, I'm happy to address it. Oh, she says she's coming. Okay. Hi.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Perfectly.
So I remember I studied a little bit of metaphors related by in college, when I was in college, and I would like to know what are the specific metaphors that are like, most common in the book, you know, and how do they contribute to views that universe, you know, that society from the story?
Yeah, great question. So I think with looking at the representation of the handmaids as a unit, a woman is an object or a woman is an animal, I think, come up very frequently, because obviously the purpose of these women in that society is that they're sort of moved around. So they have 3 opportunities to conceive with a particular family, and if that doesn't come together, they're moved on and they're given to a different commander, or they're allocated to a particular group or a particular family. The way that they're interacted with, if you think of the action processes in terms of transitivity, it's always that stuff is done to them or that they're given away. So that objectification of the characters is really prevalent in the language and in the metaphors. And I think that just really highlights, as I sort of mentioned, the valuelessness of these women, when in that metaphor it says if they are barren, there is only women who are fruitful and only women who are barren. And I think looking at them through the lens of things like objects, prizes, commodities, you can really see that the power structures in this text do not belong to the women.
Yeah. Very, very good. Anybody else? Yeah, Antonio?
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
I can. Hi.
Okay, thank you, Jazz, for your excellent lecture.
Very welcome.
So, I would like to ask about. Actually, I'm starting to study aesthetics reception, and I'd like to ask. I don't know if my question makes sense. If metaphor is a way to foresee how the reader is gonna receive the reading, and how as aesthetic, sorry, as we cannot foresee as well totally what a person can understand of a text, right? So that's my big question. when I'm studying aesthetic reception. It's a bit confusing. So I'd like to know if this mix of metaphor studies and aesthetic reception is a good way to foresee what a person would understand.
So I think one of the big things you could start by looking at is the metaphors we use to talk about reading. So if you think about things like immersion, to be immersed in a narrative, or that you are transported when you read, that this book is so absorbing, I couldn't put it down. You know, so actually the metaphors we use to talk about the reception of a text is always things about being taken into a place, being physically moved. You know, yourself, your diptych center is projected somewhere else. So actually, from a very base level, the metaphors we use to talk about reading can really highlight how people respond to, comprehend, appreciate a text, even without looking at the metaphors within a particular narrative. The experience can be described and pulled apart metaphorically. So I would start there.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Well, right, just to close this section, let me ask you another question, Jess. You're obviously familiar with the notion of intentional fallacy, which, among other things, states that you can't rely on the author's supposed intention to interpret a text. However, when you see so many metaphors used in a very cohesive way in a story like this, would you say that studying metaphors or applying CMT would be a way to counter-argue the intentional fallacy?
I mean, I think with certain expressive metaphors, or those where you've got a sort of extended or expanded metaphor across a narrative, there has to be some level of intent there, yes. And I think although you can't necessarily completely confirm the why that pattern is there, so what Atwood was thinking when she used those choices, the fact that there is such an obvious pattern in the language can't be ignored. So the linguistic choices are certainly intentional, even if you can't explain the intent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. Well, this has been brilliant, Dr. Knowledge. Thank you very much for being with us today and sharing a piece of your brilliancy with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for your excellent questions.
Yeah, thank you. Bye. Now, we're going to move from stylistics to second language acquisition with our second keynote speaker. Steve Kaufman is a known polyglot who speaks 20 languages, including Portuguese, and I think it's Brazilian Portuguese. He's the co-founder of LingQ, a language learning platform. His YouTube channel has over 1.20 million subscribers. With a passion for mastering languages through reading and listening, Steve has become an influential voice in the language learning community, inspiring countless learners worldwide. He's here today to talk to us about extensive reading and how this can help with second language acquisition. Steve, we're all ears.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I should say that whenever I hear that I speak 20 languages, it's important to remember that I speak some a lot better than others. So my Portuguese is not one of my stronger languages, but I understand, I can speak, but I make mistakes, which is fine. But I was asked to talk specifically about Stephen Krashen and his, basically, his theory of language acquisition. And I think there are a few things that are very important. I can realize, having listened to the previous speaker, that what I have to say is at a level of language competence that's much, much less than all of those who were able to participate in the discussion from Professor Knowledge. I address my comments more to people who are starting into a language or don't feel that they are at the level they want to be in the language and they want to improve in the language. And historically, language instruction has been based on the idea that if you teach the formula of the language, the grammar of the language, and if you can somehow induce people to produce the language, that they will learn the language and they'll become proficient speakers of the language. That is simply not the case. I think Dr. Krashen has pointed out that we learn a language when we have a meaningful message, a message that we're interested in. And if we can, and messages, and if we can read and listen to things of interest to us, so that we're motivated more by understanding the message than we are by trying to improve in the language, that under those circumstances, we will do better. And that's certainly been my experience. Because, and I think we understand that better now because we understand how our brains work very much in the way artificial intelligence works. In other words, we need to be bombarded by so much corpus, so much text, so much input, so much audio and reading material, that the brain starts to form connections. The brain starts to anticipate what's coming in the language. And once we are at that stage through massive listening and reading, it is then much easier to understand explanations of grammar, to make sense of declension tables, and to even have a hope of pulling out words that we need when we're trying to speak. So I think that's his explanation. And I think, he talks about the input hypothesis. So we learn through input primarily. We don't learn by practicing. We don't learn by doing drills. We don't learn by doing grammar tests. The second thing is that there's a difference between sort of deliberately learning a language and naturally acquiring the language. In fact, we acquire the language naturally if we get enough input. The third thing he talks about is the monitor hypothesis. If we are trying to think about, is this correct? If we're monitoring our output based on what we remember of the grammar rules, we will never be able to speak. So therefore, the excessive emphasis on grammar instruction, in fact, makes it more difficult for people to become fluent in a language. He also says there's a natural order of acquisition. So it doesn't matter how much the teacher tries to say, today we're going to do the subjunctive, or today we're going to learn the colors. It's not going to be learned in that order. It's going to be learned in a natural order, because the brain is going to encounter, whether it be vocabulary items or structures, in different contexts. And we now know from magnetic resonance imaging that the greater the variety of contexts where we meet these words or these structures, and this is particularly true of verbs, the greater the likelihood that we will remember them. And repeatedly forcing ourselves to try to learn, grammar tables, conjugation tables, and so forth, is extremely inefficient. And I would direct Brazilian language learners, not just learners of English. I mean, the world doesn't all have to learn English. There's many languages in the world. But he said, o prazer da leitura é o pressuposto de tudo, ou mais. Quem gosta de ler tem nas mãos as chaves do mundo. So the key is to become a reader. Mas o que vejo acontecer é o contrário, because there's far too much emphasis in forcing people to answer comprehension questions and to analyze, and all of that destroys the pleasure of reading. Ruben Alves is a magnificent educator who emphasizes the importance of pleasure. So if a language learner can find things of interest to them, some people may be interested in literature, some people might be interested in sport, some people might be interested in cooking. It doesn't matter. It has to be things that are interesting. And if you enjoy reading, you will acquire the language. First of all, you will acquire the skill, the love of reading, which is a tremendous asset to take through life. But you have to do that based on choosing things of interest to you and not overly complicating things, not overly analyzing, not asking. I hate it, for example, in learning a language, if I'm asked comprehension questions. Whatever I understood, that's my comprehension. That's for me. Me communicating with the text, I'm happy. Don't force me to answer questions for which I don't have an answer. I don't remember what happened, or I misunderstood it. It doesn't matter, because it's the input, it's the language flowing over my brain that is helping me to learn the language. So that's sort of by way of a brief introduction. I'd be happy to take any questions. I was told that I was supposed to keep it to 10 minutes. I don't have a watch here. I don't know how long I've been. So I'm not going into sort of the depths of the language. I'm going into what I think is Krashen's very elegant and revolutionary understanding of how we learn languages, and which matches how AI works. And that is to say, we need massive input. And eventually when we go to speak, we will make lots of mistakes. And if we're constantly second guessing ourselves, trying to compare what we're saying with, grammar instruction, we won't do very well. Whereas if we allow ourselves to continue making mistakes, and if we continue our listening and reading activities, we will eventually improve at our pace, which may differ from person to person. So that's a brief introduction. Be happy to take questions.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Steve. Yes, I really like Dr. Stephen Krashen's theory, and I've known it for quite some time now. And I even applied some of it to my studies. I'm also a polyglot of sorts, not 20 languages, but 6 languages. I'm trying to add a 7th one. But when I studied German, I tried to do exactly like Dr. Stephen Krashen said. But one thing I found particularly challenging was finding study materials to do just that. I'm also a teacher. I teach English, and I still find it very, very hard to find textbooks that apply this theory of language acquisition. If you take, for example, very famous textbooks like English File by Oxford University Press, it practically go against everything that Stephen Krashen said. And although I really find it particularly efficient, the idea of extensive reading and extensive input to make students acquire language rather than learn it, I find it tremendously difficult to find study materials to help me do that. So I know you created a platform to get you the materials you need to actually any student who wants to learn English using this theory can go to a platform and study there. So can you talk a little about how you created your platform? What is there? What students may find useful when they go there, and what kind of study materials you make available there?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the world of language learning has changed dramatically. It used to be that the teacher had a textbook. In many cases, we had to buy the textbook. Textbooks are tremendously expensive and overpriced, and they're not very useful. Today, the language material that we can potentially use to learn a language, even in languages like Turkish. I was recently in Turkey. There's just a limitless supply of language learning material available online. It comes in different forms. So we're starting from the beginning in a language. Then, within Link, which is our platform, we have what we call the mini stories. We have 60 stories, which are essentially the same in every language, where the same story is told in, I did this, she did this, she's going to do this, different persons, different tenses, the same vocabulary, lots of high frequency verbs. We end up listening to these stories. We do story 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You listen, you don't understand, you read, you save a few words, you review the words, you listen again, and there's a gradual process of lots of repetitive listening. When we start into a new language, at least in my experience, we have a high tolerance for repetition, for things that are not intrinsically so interesting, because we are very motivated to discover this new language. But after a while, the brain craves novelty, interesting things. So after a few months, we want to explore. And that's where the world of the internet comes in, and that's what Link does. With Link, you can bring in ebooks, Netflix, YouTube, anything you want. There's so much stuff out there. And within our own platform, you can import an ebook, you can import an audio file, it'll automatically transcribe it, so that you always have audio and transcript, audio and text available to learn. You can break it up into studying it sentence by sentence. But the point is, there is no shortage of material. If you are interested in improving your English, and you are interested, in the works of Margaret Atwood, you can find podcasts discussing that. You can find all kinds of stuff. You can find podcasts on gardening, cooking, literature, history, doesn't matter. I found podcasts on Turkish history. Very difficult for me because I've only been at Turkish for 5 months. But if I can get the audio and then I can get the text and I can look up the words, gradually I am pursuing something of interest to me. I'm not saying I want to improve my Turkish. I want to learn about Turkish history. I'm doing it in Turkish. My level of comprehension, if I just listen to the audio, is low. But if I can then also read it and review the words, gradually it gets better. So the availability of textbooks, if we say that language learning material can be divided into beginner material, sort of low intermediate material, and then genuine intermediate through advanced, which is the same. All right. So the beginner material should be lots of repetition, high frequency verbs. You listen many, many times. Soon you get tired of doing that. The brain wants novelty. So then podcasts are very good as sort of intermediate material because typically people are, when they speak in a conversation, they are using less sophisticated vocabulary than you would find in a book. So typically I move from my mini stories to podcasts. You cannot, with AI, you can automatically transcribe a podcast if you can get a hold of the MP3 file, which unfortunately is not always the case. And then once you're beyond that, you can go to anything. So your question, if the question is learning material, I would say that in the present world with, MP3 files and everything that's available on the internet and online dictionaries and, applications like Link, it's limitless. It's limitless. And so people can literally choose to learn from things of interest to them, which is very powerful. So you're not relying on the teacher telling you, you must read this book or you must, learn from this material. You can learn from anywhere. And insofar as the structure of the language, it's not difficult. I can Google Portuguese verbs. I can Google the subjunctive in Portuguese. I can Google anything and get it. I can buy a little grammar book this thick. I wouldn't buy a thick grammar book because you're going to review it from time to time. You'll forget it, review it again, forget it. That's not where the meat of the language learning takes place. The meat of the language learning comes from acquiring, a large library on your iPhone of learning material in Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, Russian, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, perfect. There's a question on YouTube, a very interesting question actually, by Francisco Romario Nunes. His question is, which is best to acquire vocabulary, reading for pleasure or reading for information?
Well, ideally, you're interested in the information. So pleasure, satisfaction. If I'm interested in Turkish history, that's pleasure to me. All right. Typically, nonfiction is easier. So one of the things that I did in Turkish, I went to ChatGPT. I said, tell me, which are the 10 most popular self-help books in 2023? Self-help material is very easy because there's a lot of the same stuff over and over again. And then so he gave me a list. So let's say Atomic Habits. So then I say, please give me a 1,000-word summary in Turkish of the book Atomic Habits. Well, of course, ChatGPT will spit that out in no time at all. Brrr, here you got 1,000 words in Turkish, Atomic Habits. And then I study that. That is information, but it's easy. Now, my reading of Turkish history is more difficult. What's even more difficult, I got myself a Turkish. First of all, I subscribe to a Turkish audiobook ebook website. Okay. So I have a 1-year subscription. I can take as many books as I want. Literature is a lot more difficult. So I bought a book written by a Turkish writer she lives in the UK part of the time. She's quite well known in Turkey. It's interesting, but it's tremendously difficult. Literature is much more difficult than nonfiction. So I don't know if the question was reading for information or reading nonfiction versus fiction. Fiction is going to be more difficult because fiction deals with things that, if we're learning the language, that we're not familiar with. The more familiar you are with the context, the easier it's going to be. So I know something about history. So it's not totally unfamiliar. When it comes to self-help, I know exactly what they're talking about. So once you get into literature in another culture, another scenery, birds and nature and emotions and stuff, it's a lot more difficult.
Yes, certainly, especially taking what Dr. Knowledge has said regarding metaphors. When you embark on reading literature in a foreign language, you're going to see a whole bunch of new metaphors, which you don't know, which you must know in order to understand your reading.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, any more questions? Don't be shy.
Okay.
Yeah, this is it.
All
Well,
right. Well, great
yes.
pleasure. Foi um grande prazer falar com você em inglês. Também poderia falar em português, mas meu português é mais uma portunhol, porque falo espanhol muito melhor do português, mas também entendo tudo e posso expressar, exprimir, I get confused, tudo o que quero dizer, com erros,
Perfect. Well, I must tell you, your pronunciation of mão is surprisingly good.
Uh-huh. Well,
Whenever a foreigner says he can speak Portuguese, I doubt they can pronounce the A tilde as in noun, as in mão, but you mastered it. Yeah.
Well, I don't know
Very
about
good.
master, but I try to repeat what I hear.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, Steve
Thank you.
Kaufman, for your brilliant presentation. I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought that everyone is going to try to digest later and
Okay.
try to apply to their teaching. I myself, I'm going to try to apply what you've shown us to my teaching and to my learning experience as well.
Okay, good.
And yes.
And I should point out too one thing. Ruben Malves was a major influence on me when I was learning Portuguese, because he has all kinds of in those days there were no MP3 files to download, but I bought his CDs. I used to listen to him. He's got a wonderful voice, and he's a wonderful, has a great attitude when it comes to education. And I certainly would recommend Brazilian Portuguese speakers should tune into Ruben Malves, who unfortunately passed away.
Yeah. Well, once again, Steve, thank you very much. It has been a brilliant presentation, and Dr. Knowledge, fantastic as always. And we hope to meet you again in the future in another presentation like this. You're always welcome to come and talk to us about whatever you find interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Well, folks, now we're going to have a 5-minute break, and we'll come back to discuss some details about the program. Okay, so take 5 minutes to have some water, to have a coffee, or maybe a milk or tea, anything you like. So I'll be back in 5 minutes. Egressos colegas da comunicação, esqueci de mencionar isso, mas a segunda parte da aula inaugural não precisa ser transmitida, porque a gente vai fazer só uma conversa com os alunos.